Vielen Dank, dass Sie gekommen sind. Es wird noch ein langer und ein aufregender Abend. Wir starten relativ leise und kammermusikalisch, so I'm going to shift into English. So we're going to start with the chamber music, and then there will be the second step will be Mona Ida, the local regional singer-songwriter. And after this, the final act, you will see a really enthusiastic and powerful performance by Mr. Tarek Atoui. Tarek, thanks for coming, and please give him an applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Tarek is an absolutely great musician, and I'm so happy that you were willing to come again.
Well, thank you. No.
Tarek was already here almost exactly 1 year ago, and maybe some of you attended the performance. It was at the anniversary of the Kunsthaus Bregenz, its 25th anniversary last year. No, 20th, sorry. Yeah, it was absolutely great. Tarek was born in Lebanon.
Yes.
Lives in Paris.
Exactly.
And this talk, as well as the performance afterwards, belongs to a series of events. All are about the question of music, or the interest in music by artists that are coming from the realm of the visual arts.
Yes.
And we had already Samson Young, Hong Kong-based artist, and Marinella Senatore, Italian. She did a procession, a parade through the city of Bregenz. Maybe you had also the opportunity to attend it. It was like months ago, almost a month ago. Mm-hmm. And Tarek Atoui is the third one. And I was interested in your practice because we had already a conversation at noon. You are dealing with the question of sound, music, but from the viewpoint of other perspectives. Do you consider yourself a musician? This is a good question for the very beginning.
Yes. Well, yes, I do. After several years, I started to consider myself a musician. Because initially, I started music quite late, at the age of 19, 20. And I studied electroacoustic music in France in a way that is between music, sound art, and open practices. So it was a class that was quite special at that time, that mixed students from musicology, from visual arts, and from an all public. And I was the student coming from all public because I didn't have a background neither in music nor in visual arts. So I was coming from economy.
Really?
Yes.
Why economy?
Because that's how I got to France out of Lebanon.
No way. So how do you get with economy to France?
Well, I got a grant from the French government after my studies at the age of 18, and it's a grant that they give to a few students from francophone countries. And the deal with to get this grant is either to study mathematics or economy. So no grant for arts. I wanted to do theater in the beginning, but nobody supported me in this. Mm-hmm. So I did economy. And then in France,
and are you still interested in subjects like this?
Well, yes, certain aspects of it, because what I did, like these studies were very general, so it was like finance and the history of economy and marketing and several aspects related to business in a very large sense. But what I stayed with was the history of economy and notions of cultural management. Those are things I kept with me as tools for my practice later. But to come back to this, to my artistic and musical education, to be honest, I come from sound. I really came from sound. And without the background of an acoustically trained musician or someone who knows how to read scores or to work with the heritage of classical music. So the only way I had as this outsider going to this course to be able to follow up what was happening was my love of abstraction and concepts, and how good I was in mathematics, because I could really learn lots of musical ideas of rhythm and harmony and things I was late on through mathematics. And it helped me to learn computer programmings and to start building these instruments and the software I'm working with. So, yeah.
Maybe you can explain what you're going to do afterwards, so a little bit in the basics of what you're going to do.
Sure, sure. Well, actually, I can try to find something to show you on my early start with building instruments and electronics and thinking those relations. Because what happened at some point in my practice as somebody who was learning computer music in the early 2000s is that the real-time technologies were starting, and the use of self-made electronics and self-built instruments was becoming more and more spread. So from the beginning, I was not satisfied, like in this context, with the logic according to which instruments were built, or the making of electronic experimental or musique savante was taking place. And what I mean by this is that I wanted, at an early stage of my practice, to put back the human dimension or the body in the center of music making, especially when it comes to using computers and electronics. And in this idea, what I wanted to do is kind of free the body from the constraint of the screen and the laptop, and also free the performer from these little machines that we find on the market and that were built and customized. And if we look at machines today and like how electronic instruments are done, the main logic behind is how compact they can be, and how much they can be efficient, and how much functions and parameters they have on a reduced control surface. So,
and is there anybody you can tell us who you would relate to, like a composer or a
yes.
technician or
Sure. Well, I was very much influenced by the work of a composer and inventor called Michel Weiswitz. Michel is a pioneer Dutch composer of electronic music, and he's the founder of the Steim Studios in Amsterdam, like an institution that is now about 40 years old, and who did pioneering work in real-time software. So like the first sound sampler on Macintosh was done by them. They built lots of educational tools for children to learn music and sound by creating interactive games and kind of ludic pedagogy. And the work of Michel was really inspiring in the sense that Michel, since the 80s, started to think about electronic instruments that would not use the power of the current or the power plug to get energy from, but that would rather use the energy of the sun or the wind or the electricity of the body. And that at that time, and still until today, were ideas that were very striking and very important.
From economy to ecology.
Yes, in a very yes, in a way, it's a good way to put it, actually. And so I'll show you one of these early inventions. I'll cut the sound and I'll leave it.
This was the Frideriziano in Kassel, right?
Exactly, that was like 6 years ago now for the opening of the Documenta, actually.
And I recognized the guy who filmed you. It was Owen McIntyre, the husband of Susan Phillips.
Oh, really? I didn't know. No, see, I'm happy to be doing this talk here and finding out things I did not know about. But to talk about this idea of interface or instrument, you can see here, this is one instrument I built for the Documenta, and the size of it is already huge. Like, in a way, the surface of control, or this interface of the instrument, is blown up in a way that the body is set free and not anymore focused on this little surface and these little buttons and cut from the audience or from the situation. On the contrary,
and you're not dependent on a score, but how is your script? Do you have an idea or dramaturgy, or what? How do you create it and keep it in mind?
Yes. Well, in this project, it was impossible. The whole idea of this instrument on the Documenta was to create a machine that was totally unstable. So all these functions and buttons and sensors that were on the tables change function every time I turned the instrument on. So what would be one time a button to control volume can become a button to control pitch. And what would be a button to change a sound would become a button to quit the application.
Mm-hmm. And why would you do that?
Well, precisely because the idea behind it, at least in this part, I was pretty much interested in this idea of free, total improvisation, and in this relation between performer and machine, like kind of to lose this control I had over, or that usually a musician has over an instrument, or this familiarity we have with it. You see, like a piano player can just by gestural memory find back the keys and the notes he wants to play. I wanted to break this relationship with the instrument, so kind of created a situation in which I was vulnerable facing this machine. And on a sonic level...
So the machine plays with you more than you play with the machine?
Well, it kind of plays me, or in the beginning it's playing me, because the computer that is behind this did also have in it like thousands of sounds that came from all my library of sounds, and that were randomly selected by the machine. And it plays, when I turn it on, it's just playing hundreds of those sounds. So the performance already starts with a lot of sounds being present. And the idea is to figure out how this is happening by taking out material and elements to be able to start again. So, and this was a total, like a chaotic situation of total improvisations in which building something over duration was similar to playing chess in a way. So you had to, or I had to, think of 4 or 5 moves ahead of something, and to be always very attentive to the results I was getting, like from moving a hand. I had to listen, okay, what is this hand now triggering, or what is it producing, and then decide what would be the gesture after.
And did you refer also to the history of music, like in the 50s, high-end music in the 50s, which is very much dependent on chants?
Yes. There was some of my strongest influence, or my strongest influences until today, are the work of post-World War II contemporary music composers. So of course we can think of Cage, Stockhausen, Pierre Schaeffer, and the electroacoustic music school, but also composers who wrote for orchestras like Ligeti or Chelsea were very, very strong and important to me. And I grew up with this idea artistically that there was a kind of shift that happened at some point between music, visual arts, cinema, sculpture, that there was a fragmentation that, or a kind of specialization that started to take place that disconnected arts and forms from each other. But what I revendicate in this, coming from this heritage of these composers, is kind of to reconnect worlds again, because like that's...
I learned, I don't know if it's true, but I learned that the first electronic music studio was built in Ulm, connected to, which is very close to Bregenz, that's why I'm telling you.
Yes.
And this was also connected with what you said, it was connected to other concrete movements of art, like Max Bill. So Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And to talk, for example, how I dealt with this legacy, like for the use of randomness that Cage introduced by throwing the dice, in my work, it became kind of tamed randomness, or what I call controlled hazard, in the sense that the Cage throwing dice is total hazard. And in my case, it is now finding conditions and rules for which in which the random event can occur. So in this sense, like to give an example, it is like using repetition that would happen randomly, but then would start to also change randomly. But there you feel that there is a stability in the way I work with randomness. So it's not always generating total chaos, but there's an abstract logic to how events are shifting and happening, for example. Or I can give you another example of using randomness is
How do you keep it in mind when you say, do you have a certain structure, do you have a script, do you have
yes,
some sort of logic? Or?
yes, like in general, I always have skeletons or like structures that are pretty open. I'll try to show you tonight's structure, for example. Let me find it. I hope I did not lose my score for after the talk. I get worried. Sorry, I'll try to find it. There it is. So, I don't know if you can see that. That's tonight's structure. And so I know
what does it say? What does it say?
Well, it is names of the collages I'm going to play, their duration and their speed, and all of them here, and then a certain order of how they would appear, or like certain possibilities of shuffling them to say part one, then two, then three. But each of these parts inside is improvisation happening. So it is kind of structured improvisation, and I know where I'm going. But inside this skeleton, I can also shift parts. So like the middle is flexible, and I can adapt to the situation. And what I mean by adapting to the situation is listen to what's happening around me, be attentive to the crowd, hear the sound in the space, and feel the energy of this whole momentum and change things according to it.
And do you have some sort of a structure in mind? Was it, for example, for classical music, like the four movements of a symphony, like the first one is fast, the second one is slow, then the third one is a dance, and the fourth one is again fast, but faster than the first one. Is there anything such as a bigger frameworks?
There is, but for tonight also there is one. But it's not totally fixed. You see, it's not like the set of rules that I abide to whatever the situation is. And what is happening tonight also sometimes happens on pieces where I invite other people, because in my practice tonight I'm in solo, but there are lots of moments where I collaborate with acoustic musicians, with traditional musicians, with musicians from all sorts of backgrounds. And the ensembles can get sometimes to 20, 22 people playing with me. And in this case, like one time, like one of these examples I did once, it was at the Serpentine for the marathon in 2012 as well. And the idea was, I had this ensemble of 22 people, and we were working on an evening inspired by Arabic music and how traditional Arabic music used to happen over 4 or 5 hours as one concert, and how inside this concert, sometimes the musicians stop after 45 minutes and agree between them on the structure of the piece that follows. So they were able to compose on the fly to say, okay, on the coming piece, I'll start with a solo, then you'll sing this poem, we'll be playing in this mode, and then we will get into tutti, and then from here go out. And they were able to really discuss it very quickly and execute it. And on the performance I did at the Serpentine, inspired by this idea, I had written, I think, a set of 15 scenarios in envelopes, and the musicians did not know about them. And each time an envelope was ending, I would choose the envelope that follows and give it to them. So the musicians were getting the instructions little by little, and at the same time they were all sitting by the stage, so there for 5 hours nonstop. Nobody goes to the backstage or like waits his turn and says, okay, I'll come when you need me. Until then, I'll talk to my friends on the phone. It was creating a unity with this tension of these envelopes coming in at the last minute. And my role in conducting was not just being on stage or in a fixed position. I was walking among the audience, sometimes sitting in the audience, sometimes going out of the space and listening from outside, sometimes being on stage and performing. And the conduction was coming from feeling this flow. So yes, that's another way of using structure. And,
is there a name for this Arabic practice of ongoing series of pieces? Or?
In Arabic music, you mean? Yes, it is called, it's classical Arabic music, and what we know today as tarab. Tarab is a word that we hear often nowadays in the Arab world. It refers to now, unfortunately, all kinds of music. Like even somebody who is singing a Christmas pop song in Arabic can call it tarab. But initially, 100 years ago, the idea of it was that it was classical music that had the aim of inducing a feeling of trance and enchantment for the audience and for the musicians, and that used precise principles of music writing to reach to this state of trance. And it's not a religious trance, it is what we called an urban trance at that time. So it's not the Sufi trance or the rural trance of religious chant, it's a state of enchantment in itself. And the way Arabic music, or certain notorious composers in Arabic music thought these systems is, for instance, to fix the scales and the tonal modes are still the same, to create like a kind of psychological mattress in which the audience felt comfortable, and around which everything could change. The arrangements, the rhythms, the poems, the structure, like the lyrics, all this can be then declined from fixing the harmonic mode. And yes, these were ideas that came out that I found out about years after I studied music. I did not know anything about the history of Arab music until really late, but they taught me a lot and influenced a lot my practice.
Yeah, we experience Arabic music in daily life on cars and so on.
Yes.
And you know, there's always this problem for us from the learned or socialization in Western listening, and we get troubles with a quarter tone situation.
Yes.
But there's also similarities with your electronic practice to this kind of singing in quarter tones, right?
Yes.
And the instruments in Western history are not tuned for quarter tones.
No. Some are tunable, like you can, as Cage did with the prepared piano, you could.
Yeah.
You could. But initially they aren't. And actually there's also an important notion in Arabic music that is fundamental to creating this feeling of tarab, or like enchantment. It is the heterophony that is inherent to Arabic music. And heterophony is a form of polyphony, let's say, of multiple voices that have the ability to cross and to intertwine without all following each other strictly. So it's a skill or an ability that a musician acquires in his learning, where he is able to follow a grid or an abstract rhythmic grid, and at the same time go out of it. So the Arabic music orchestra, the classical one, is 6 musicians, so it's not a big formation. And these 6 musicians can play at different speeds and fall back together and create different voices inside one sonic body. And it allows and it's something very different from the tutti, you know, or like when having a conductor that is making sure that everybody's on the same pace and tempo. Here, this multiplicity of voices would allow the listener to focus on the guy who is playing the oud, the lute, and then progressively glide to the one who is playing the ney, the flute, and then go to the other one who is playing the qanun. And interestingly enough, at that time, the percussion, the instrument for percussion in Arabic music, was a very small tambourine. It wasn't the darbuka and like these loud the percussive instruments we all have in mind when we speak of Arabic music today. It was a very subtle pulsation, actually, and not something that is marking time heavily. So this idea of time was very floating, and this multiplicity of voices created a space for freedom for the listener to choose who to follow and where to go.
Can we move forward with your projects? Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Well,
I take your
Take my score? Well, I wish you good luck.
Actually, it's the boarding pass.
Yeah, it's my boarding pass. Well, from practices like the one at Documenta, and from practices also where I started to work with bigger ensembles like the project Antarab, I'd say I started little by little to from performance and doing lots of sound performance on these notions, and also working a lot in outdoor contexts like you saw at the Documenta in Kassel. I did a lot of performances like tonight outdoor and in places like Beirut, Egypt, China, Chile, where the ideal concert hall in the sense for electroacoustic or electronic music is absent. And this extensive traveling I had at the point of my life also liberated me from like the pure, the good conditions of presenting this type of music. And it was a very good experience, honestly, to get out of this work context that is only available in a few countries, you see. It's not something that you can always count on to have multiple speakers or of a high quality and a space with perfect acoustics and things like these. And so from this period, other ideas started to emerge on how to work with sound and what is the power of sound in terms of transformation and evocation. Something that also started to come to me when I was working on Arabic music is to see the orality of Arabic culture. And, maybe some of you know that in Arab culture, poetry, music...
religion. Religion is oral history.
Yeah, yes.
Not history, oral practice. Yeah.
Yes. And there was no sculpture or painting, calligraphy but the teaching of all this was passed on orally. And there was a very precise idea behind this orality, was to give a culture the possibility to adapt to its era and to not have things that become fixed when you write them down, so they become like rigid or immobile. So a poem could be said, the same poem could be altered over time, and we have like l'Iliade et l'Odyssée, like very long epic poems. We don't know how they were written initially, but some people can still say them, but with today's words. But for sure, 1,000 years ago, these words didn't even exist in Arabic language. And that's an idea that also I liked a lot, like how orality and the sonic immaterial aspect of things can create change, or can create, new ideas that are away from form and objects and the materiality of things present in a space. And notably, one project that illustrates this very well is one that I did for the Berlin Biennale at some point. And I'll show you the start of this project. Yes. This project started in 13-14, when I discovered in the basement of an anthropology museum in Berlin, the Dahlem Museum, a collection of instruments that came from all over the world, but that were in storage. And in this storage situation, there were just labels on the instruments, so you did not, with serial numbers. You could not know when they were made, where, how they were played. Nothing of all these socio-cultural parameters was anymore present. And for me it was great, because it was kind of the erasure or the disappearance of these parameters, and eventually the start of a new story for these machines or a sound-making device, let's call them like this. And I started an experiment inviting 18 musicians who were very good improvisers. The first quality I was looking for is musicians who were not afraid of using blowing, bowing, percussion techniques on an instrument. So trying all the techniques like Cage proposed with the prepared piano, or Evan Parker proposed on the saxophone with continuous breathing. And I ran for several months sessions like these, where I recorded the musicians in solos and then listened to these solos. And there's a whole story around these solos and how we could access and play the collection of a of a museum and instruments that usually are not made to be played, but more to be seen and put in vitrines. So from these solos, I hosted then, from listening to these solos, I hosted a series of performances where musicians then came all together and played scores like the ones I showed you here. It was really sketches, like these in the museum, and I recorded the sounds of these performances as well. Then, for me, the second step along these lines of orality is that I took the sounds of these performances and gave them to people who made instruments. And I asked them to imagine and build the instruments that they were hearing in these tracks. And the instrument makers did not see any image or know even that I was in an anthropology museum. I said, I have those recordings, and can you build something? And the invitation was very broad. Like, it's not about imitating the sound, but getting inspired by them or relating to them, each one in his own way. And so what happened to the there were, like, I think 100 instruments we played, and those are some of them in this image. But what happened then was the creation of a new collection of instruments, and those are some of its elements and entities that came out of listening to the sound of the old instruments. And actually these instruments use air compressors, so they use pumped up air, they use electricity, they use for some very pressure or found objects like these balls of pétanque and sponges to wash and membranes of balloons. But you can see, like, they are made with the techniques and the taste of today, in a way, you see. And it is, for me, an extension or like the becoming of this sound collection just based on orality, and in a way that is different from how ethnomusicology and anthropology work with traditional music and anthropological instruments. So that's one of the ideas. And then you can imagine, of course, that there's a whole different...
Is it more unwrapping history or creating a new future, a new present, or what is the purpose in terms of time?
Well, in terms of time, like, it is kind of something present, I would say. You see, it is really creating something present, and that's out of observing the reactions or like what came out from the work of these instrument makers, because the techniques that were used and the sounds that the instruments produce are a mark of our era of today's world, especially if you follow things about instrument making and lutherie in a broad sense. But at the same time, it has a very strong connection to the future, because in a way, for me, when these instruments are played or singularly or all together, it is an echo or a continuation of the sounds of the old ones. And in the same way, we were discussing a little bit the protocols of how this piece lives over time. For me, like, at some point, maybe these instruments will break, will deteriorate, and we won't be able to fix them. But it is possible at some point, when these instruments will break in my project, to go back to the original footage of the performance inside the Anthropology Museum and to build back a new instrument. So I'm very curious to repeat this experience, let's say 20, 30 years from now, and see what will come out and how from the same audio file we will get an instrument that is totally different from these horns that you see here in the image, or these ones, or this flute, for example. So there's a connection to the present in the sense when these instruments sound, and there's a connection to the future because of this orality and the potentiality of sound to transform shape and forms.
But you're not working with language. It's just sound. It's not words. It's not sense. It's not meaning.
Well, the only... I have a lot of problem working with voice. For me, the hardest instrument is voice, to be honest. And the hardest musician to work with is a singer. The ego of a singer sometimes is just hard to manage. No, but joke aside, the only time I worked with language in a way that went in depth into what language could be was with sign language. And yes, and this happened in the context of a investigation, and I started 6 years ago now, on which the starting point was to collaborate and to talk to people who are deaf or who have different levels of deafness, so profoundly deaf to mildly deaf to hard of hearing, and of different ages, cultures as well, and to consider deafness as an ability, or like as a form of, some colleagues call it expertise, and not as a handicap. And to say, okay, then what do we have to learn? What can deaf people teach us in terms of making music? And how, out of this conversation, we can revisit our ways of working with a conductor, or working with a space, or setting up an orchestra, or making instruments, or writing a score, or managing time. And this project took me to lots of places and was extremely rich, and I learned a lot on it of what sound is outside of the ears, or what from the phonic, what is sound that is not vibration conducted through air and received by the ears. And here the teachings are many. So for instance, we can all think at the first thing that comes to our mind is maybe the bass, or how we can feel the bass with our body, like we will feel some bass in our bodies later on tonight, and how this is a sensorial way of relating to sound. But there is also the way of listening with the sense of touch, and how we can listen with the fingers, or listen with our skeleton and the bones. There is also ways of of listening with the eyes, out of seeing objects in movements. It's really things that working with deaf persons taught me. Like for instance, time where we gave students from school for the deaf sound recorders, like the little device, Zoom device we have, and told them, go into the city and record whatever sound you like. And what the students did was go and record, well, what we observed is that we're going to record things that were in motion, although they didn't hear them. Like, for example, to go record the policemen's sirens that were blinking. But they were just blinking, they were not making sound. We knew they weren't making sound, but for these students, movement meant sound. Or to go record the ventilation system of an AC outside of a building in the middle of a street that was so noisy you couldn't hear the fan, but you could just see it working. Or to go record a construction site, thinking that workers will be producing sound, and actually there was no sound, the workers were on break, but the students were recording it as something that is supposed to be loud. So sound is movement as well. And inside this, there was a very important section where sound was also signs actually, or signified with hand gestures and sign language. And although sign language does not, unfortunately, like I'm talking in a very general way, there is no sign language. There are languages and dialects, and sign language is very rich and super complicated. But in several places in relation to different sign languages I saw, there is not a lot of vocabulary that is given to a deaf person to be able to talk about sound. And here for me there was a whole range of exploration on what could, how we could signify sound with gestures. I'll try to show you some experiences we did in that frame as well. Sorry, let me find it. Actually, the project is called Within, and I worked on this project with a duo of curators called Council in Paris, Sandra Terjman and Gregory Castera, and together we led research in different places. One of them was Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates with the Sharjah Art Foundation. And a part of this research, these are the moments, for example, when students were recording the city. Okay, and I'll take you to a part where, yes, we started to investigate. This is Geoffrey Mansfield, an architect who is deaf and who was working on this notion of trying to find ways to describe sounds, intensities, textures, timbres with gestures. Like here, for example, that's him filming himself. And he's describing the sound that dirt makes. And there's a whole exploration like this of, we did some of it in video, but you can see like this work on language and sign language and its potential in terms of finding new codes or like new elements of ways of vocabulary for conducting or finding common ground to conduct a piece or an improvisation. As an extension of this also, what this inspired me to do was work on an instrument that used, I'll try to find images of this instrument, that used sensors, motion capture, and had could detect behavioral gestural behaviors that were coming from sign language and play bass and vibration accordingly. And wait, I'll try to see where my instrument is. Yeah. So this instrument is actually, part of this instrument is this module, and that's one unit of it. But then the whole instrument is 3 units, and players stand on a platform under which there are subwoofers. So they are almost in direct contact with the sound and the vibration they are producing. And then they stand on top of this sensor, and moving the hand produces sound, but the closer you get to sign language, the more result you get. And this, for instance, was done at Berkeley, at the Berkeley University with the Meyer Sound Company, and lots of competences involved in creating something like this. But it is also something that can make architectures vibrate, for instance. And you can, with specific gestural behavior, excite the metal inside the building, or the glass, or the wood. And therefore, what happens is that the building becomes a speaker or a resonator of the instrument. Like here we can see on this activation of the instrument that some people who could not hear were using the wood of the building or the glass, or sometimes the metal or to feel the sound and catch what was happening. And that's a relation of or that's an example, one of the examples of how we moved from language into a totally different sensory experience that includes space, presence of people, and yes, and also other ways of writing, other ways of listening even to what is happening, because to be able to, it's very hard when you are playing an instrument like this to be aware of the effect that you have on the whole space. Also, that was for me quite intriguing, because it changes the player's behavior a bit. Like I wanted to change my behavior when creating this unstable machine at the Documenta. Here there is something similar, where you listen to the movements you're doing or try to grasp what it's producing on a wider scale.
I'm trying to think the reverse, because sometimes in this building here, built by Peter Zumthor, I got the feeling that when you walk up the floors upstairs, somehow, we had the discussion already, I somehow feel that he treated light as if it were sound. So you have in the upper floors, you have like this windows all around, but you don't see outside. So the light is coming in a diffusion. There's no source of light to be seen in the Zumthor building here at the Kunsthaus. You only have light coming towards you.
Yes.
And sometimes you feel it not just by seeing it, by your eyesight, you also feel it in terms of an atmosphere that surrounds you. And this is maybe an equivalent to how we perceive sound, because sound coming from anywhere, there are some speakers, but you hear us from everywhere, and also from your interior bones and so on. and maybe he treated light as if it was sound. So this would be the reverse idea of yours, saying, how can we see sound, although it's not vibrating?
Yeah. How can we see sound, although it's not vibrating? Well, that's interesting. Because to me, like, sound is always vibration.
Yeah, sure. That's the definition of sound.
It's not always vibration. That's for sure. That's the physical definition. But one aspect I forgot to mention that this project taught us also is that sound can be also the memory of a sound. You see, or the interior sound that is projected, or can be the sound that certain people.
Yeah, we were talking about Beethoven at noon. You know,
You see,
there must be some imagination to create a symphony without hearing.
Yes, or like it reminds me also of a project that we looked at in this in our research by Dora Garcia, the Hearing Voices Cafe, where she went into different countries and worked with people who hear voices all the time in their mind, and it was about this, imaginary voice actually, but that is affecting people's life. You see, like it's not something to be taken seriously. You see, so there is a sound that is not vibrating, that is inside of us, and maybe it is the reason why I am here again today, because of the nice memory of last year. I got invited again, but maybe the real experience today will not be as good as the memory.
We can ask ourselves how we kind of preserve sounds.
Yeah.
But it's a lot more difficult to remember noise, so non-music sounds, atmospheric sounds, and others.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please. So.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, because you told this story about deaf people trying to describe sounds they cannot hear but feel. And I once learned about a project in East Germany, about the eastern part of Germany, actually East Berlin, and there was a research, what would people remember, what would describe the soundscape of East Berlin? So it would be, they were asked people, what would they remember? Yes. What is characteristic? And do you know what they answered mostly?
No, what was it?
Fountains.
Fountains?
Yeah.
Music.
Because fountains were for GDR, for the DDR people, the most important, they were important place, because fountains were placed in squares, and squares were allowed to, public spaces to meet, and the sound of the fountains guaranteed also to speak without being observed.
Yes, yes. Well, there is something, I think, that is very close to the sense of scent here, what we are discussing, you see, and how maybe of all the senses, the sense of scent can tie us back to memory and to nostalgia of, like, all of a sudden you get captured by scent and it brings you back years. Everybody had this experience, I believe, no? And it's one of the moments I really like, the memory of a sound, you see. Unfortunately, we don't train it. It's something that I know some musicians who are really good at remembering, like a melody or something they heard once in their life, and afterwards they can recite it again. But in my case, and in tonight's performance case, a lot of what I built and did was based on memory, like kind of trying to fall back into these moments of childhood, of teenagerhood, of early musician, say, what did I used to listen to at that time? And to kind of dive into this intimacy, or into this kind of personal story, and dig back materials or tracks from it, and then do a collage between these tracks and newer things or things of mine, and like create this thing that is really going from the affect or from deep inside the mind. And unfortunately, we are also today used to surfing on the internet and going very quickly. Like you say, I want this song, you go on YouTube, you go on Spotify, you find it, you see. But what I really enjoy as a practice at my level is not to surf on the web, but to surf in my head, and to try to do this kind of cadavre exquis, where one song reminds me of another, reminds me of a third, and then the web is a tool for me to find them back. But it's not the source I'm counting on to find.
So we learned that you dislike singers, but do you sing yourself?
Huh?
Do you sing yourself?
Do I sing?
Sing.
Do I sing? Oh no, I'm such a bad singer.
But would you be able to sing such memories now?
No, it would be like really no, I cannot even sing two notes correctly, you see. I'm really a disaster in terms of singing, but I have them in my head as emotion, as a memory body, as things that are sometimes related to events or to people I liked or to a feeling of warmth in Beirut when I was a kid. It's really different and diverse.
So this means you need an instrument.
Sorry?
This means you need an instrument.
Yes. Well,
yeah, to distribute it and to communicate it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, that's also another notion and element of somebody who makes instruments. You see, like I have a lot of instruments. I have a lot of tools to produce now today. Like that. Instruments like the ones I showed you, I've done a lot and all in different contexts. But the more I worked on the notion of instrument, I found so much potential to it. You see, from not just a musical point of view, but also like an artistic, social, human point of view as well. See, like the instrument is not a finality in itself on my project. It's a tool to create certain momentums or to create specific experiences. And it's like on the project, within the project on sound and deafness, it is a tool to continue exploring what sound is from a deaf perspective, what making music or playing together is. But inside these instruments, sometimes, especially if you work in a arts context, you cannot also discard their sculptural that aspect or dimension as well. You see, it's not. I know they're not sculptures; they are instruments. Is something I always remind myself and others about. But at the same time, I'm not forbidding people to have the experience of them as sculptures. Of course, there is always sound, and they're not dead objects in a space. But then comes the responsibility of when you do such pieces of how do you share them and how do you disseminate them. The same way you would say, how can I share this memory of something? And here there is, like I would say, a fractal of my work. You see, like I'm not Roland or Yamaha now making instruments and selling them on the market, but inside the project or within a given process of these, there's always the thought at some point of how can this thing that was created sometimes in the visual arts context and shown in museum and Kunsthaus and sometimes also performing arts festival, how can it go back to the music world or like fall back into the hands of those who make music or like deaf people who would want to play these things and would want them available. So making these ideas and inventions available as a fractal or a second life of my projects is something that I'm more and more preoccupied with. And to give you an example, some of the things I've built and done, along the same ways I gave sounds to instrument maker to imagine things from, now I'm in the process of giving the circuitry of certain instruments or the schemes or sometimes just the sounds again to hackers and to people whose job is to hack instruments and make cheaper ones. And I'm giving them and say, please hack me, make something new, but with just one condition, that what you make can be produced at cheap price and shared with people who can buy it on their website or in record stores or here and there.
And what will we be hearing afterwards? So can you do a little introduction? Or don't even want to do that?
Yeah. Well, no, of course. It's a pleasure to talk about what we will hear afterwards. We will hear a selection of tracks that I have been listening to over the last 25 years. And they are collages. It's really collages of these tracks in different periods of my life coming together, sometimes in a dancey way, sometimes in a more abstract, let's say experimental way. But it is this journey into my personal library and collection.
Memory.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Anything to add?
Anything to add? Well, no. Like one thing, I'm very, very
Keen
happy.
to say.
Keen
to say.
Keen to say, yes. Is that it's one of the rare times I get invited twice, 2 years in a row to a place, and it's a great thing. Also, I discovered because what I did last year is I continued to do this year, and it's something I didn't do in other places. You see, so tonight is not like a piece I rehearsed and did 100 times, and that I will be touring. It's much more something that is personal and will happen here. And next time I take it, the memory will change, and I will reshuffle everything and do it in a different way. But what I was really grateful for the Kunsthalle here and yourself is to give me the chance to prolong this kind of memory exercise and this side project. That's
no. We are honored, and we are very much looking forward to hearing.
Fantastic. Well,
so please come, please stay. Any questions from your side? Gibt es irgendwelche Fragen von Ihnen? Otherwise, we would change location. The next step will be Mona Ida, draußen auf der Bühne. And Tarek will start afterwards. It's approximately 3/4 of an hour, then it's your part. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you all.